Crooked River, Chapter 13. I didn't expect that Peter Kelly would ever dare to come back to our house, not with how Pa had run him off. While we fixed supper that night, I asked Laura, "You think he'll still try to be the lawyer for Indian John?" "Perhaps," Laura said, keeping her eyes on the turnips she was cutting. "You think all he told us is true, about Indian John not being the kind of person to kill a trapper?" "I know what our Pa and the other men have said," she answered evenly. "That's what I know to be true." I felt sorry for Laura. She had been real quiet and downcast ever since Pa had sent Mr. Kelly away and scolded us. I figured she had taken a small fancy to the lawyer just in the brief moment we had met him. On account of his wavy red hair and gentle eyes, I think and I expect he would have made a good beau for her, if he hadn't been going against our Pa and defending an Indian. Pa always said the only man who would ever marry Laura was an old widower, someone who ain't interested in picking through all the apples in the barrel and will take just about anyone. "That's the fellow for you," Pa would tell her, but I knew the kind-hearted Laura would make a good wife for anyone. "You s'pose Mr. Kelly knows something about Indian John that Pa doesn't?" I kept on. "That why he's trying to defend him?" "I don't know," Laura answered, standing up and dumping her handful of turnips into the soup pot. "But he has some very peculiar beliefs about Indians." "Maybe Indian John didn't murder anyone. Couldn't that be true?" I said. "Maybe they caught the wrong person by mistake. Don't that happen sometimes?" Laura's eyes flashed toward me. You better not let Pa catch you saying something like that, Rebecca Ann Carver," she warned. "That's spreading lies and gossip." I tried to put my restless questions in the back of my mind, but it wasn't easy. While we did our mending work in the evening, I thought hard about the new calf that had already been born in our sickly cow, and what we could name it if it lived long enough. I tried to remember the words to a verse that Ma always used to recite, but my mind still circled back to Indian John and Peter Kelly. What did Mr. Kelly know? What had he said to Indian John in the loft? Laura kept her head down and her eyes fixed on her work the whole time. She didn't speak hardly a word. When Amos told me they would need help in the fields the next day, I was glad for the chance to go and leave Laura to herself. The next morning I followed Pa and the boys out to the fields. It was a real pretty morning. The wispy clouds looked like bits of wool tumbling across the cabin floor. Under my feet the dirt was cool and soft. Only thing Pa said to me was that I had better work as hard as a boy. In the field I stayed close to Amos and far from the others. He had a pointed axe for loosening the rocks and roots, and I tugged the smaller ones out of the dirt and threw them in a pile. The field had to be cleared, grubbed as the men said, before it could be plowed for corn. It was hard not to talk and fill up the empty space when you were working with Amos. He could go for hours without saying anything, stopping only to spit or take a swig of water from the jug he had set into the field dirt. The one thing I found while I was grubbing was an arrowhead point. I thought at first it was a stub of a sprouting plant, and then when I leaned closer, I realized it was a small gray arrowhead. I held it in my palm for Amos to see. "Here, see what I dug up?" "Lorenzo's got a whole collection of those," he said, not even taking half a minute to look at it. "The field's full of them." "I never found one before," I said, surprised. "How'd they get here in our field?" "How do you think, Reb?" Amos went back to chopping at the dirt. "This was Indian land long before it was ours. How do you reckon arrowheads got here?" Finding that arrowhead had a powerful effect on me because I had never before thought about Indians living on the same ground where we lived now. In my mind, they had always been on the far side of the Crooked River, or on the edges of wherever we were living. Indian lands were always beyond the river, beyond the mountain, on the other side of that lake. They had their place, we had ours, and it had never been the same place. But looking at that little gray-colored arrowhead gave me a peculiar feeling. My mind started thinking about how it would feel if in years to come someone dug up something from us Carvers, a button or a spoon that got thrown out with the dishwater, or a musket ball. Would they know we had lived here? That this had been our farm? Or would we be just like the Indian who sent this arrow flying? Would we be forgotten and long gone? I remembered how Ma's bones were buried on this land under a big hickory tree, and that she always loved. In 100 years, if they dug under that tree, would they know whose bones? I dropped the arrowhead back into the dirt and pressed the clods down hard with my bare feet to cover it. Didn't want to think about that old arrowhead and the Indians any more. My head was a mixed-up jumble. We grubbed rocks and roots the whole day, from morning to evening. By the time Pa was ready to go in for supper meal, my arms were pink from the sun, and my palms looked as if they had been rubbed across a grindstone. Lorenzo didn't take any pity on me. "Look up there at that little pile of stones you done," he said, coming over. "The pile of stones me and George have is twice the size of yours." He reached down to tug a fist-sized rock out of the ground. "You missed this one," he said, sending it clattering onto my pile. I scowled at him. "Maybe you and Cousin George ought to stay out here and find all the rest of them rocks yourself." After Lorenzo kicked a footful of dirt in my direction and ran off, I had to admit that it didn't look like me and Amos had done very much. That was the problem with grubbing out the fields. You worked for hours and hours, and it seemed as if all the same stones and roots came back. No matter how far you flung them or how fast you dug them up, you couldn't get rid of them. The earth was stubborn. That was the truth. I guess Peter Kelly must have been the same way. He wouldn't give up easily, no matter what my mean Pa said, because when we returned to the house in the evening, Laura pulled me outside and whispered real low, "Today, while you and the boys was gone in the fields, Peter Kelly stopped by here." Red Hair climbs the steps a second time to see me. I close my eyes. "You are a stranger now," I tell him. "Go away, Gichi-Mukuman, and do not return again." Red Hair says it has been many winters, and we have been separated far apart, but two things he has not forgotten. One is how we saved his ma, and two is the stories of the old ones. He says to me, "Amik, do you remember your grandmother's old story of the fox, snake, and man?" I know the story well. Many strings of lives ago, little fox risked his life to save man from the coils of a great serpent. But as time passed one winter to the next, man forgot fox's good deed, as he forgets many things. One starving moon, man drew his sharp knife to kill poor thin fox who had eaten from his cache of winter food. "Don't you remember me?" Fox cried. "Don't you remember? Do you see?" Red Hair says, "I am taking your side. I do not want to be the man who forgot." What the fox had done. I am silent for a long while, thinking of fox and man, and the great serpent. Finally I tell him, "Red Hair, no matter what the Gichi-Mukuman say about me, Amik is not guilty."